I would like to introduce Professor Michael Walsh to everybody. Michael is a professor of religion at Vassar College, which is it New York State?
It's in New York State.
New York State.
Yeah.
He's also an active member of the Asian Studies program. He teaches on a wide variety of subjects on the cultural history of the study of religion, China's political and socio-religious culture, methods and theories in the study of religion, Buddhism and monastic life, colonialism and religion, violence and religion, and the production of sacred space. His first book, Sacred Economy, is Buddhist Monasticism and Territoriality in Medieval China, is published with Columbia Press. And his most recent book, which he is talking about today, is published in February 2020, also by Columbia Press. And it is called Stating the Sacred: Religion and China and the Formation of the Nation State. He's currently working on a biography of Buddhist temple space. And also at the college, he serves on numerous committees and the intriguingly named President's Cabinet. I don't know if that's the president of the university or the United States, who knows. And he's also chair of the religion department for 4 years and director of the Asian Studies program for 3 years. And he's also currently the chair of the religion department at Vassar College. Michael, President's Cabinet?
That would be the president of the college.
Okay.
Not of the United States. Although that would be amazing to do that. But yeah, I'm not that important. Well, thank you, Louis. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for those of you who've joined us. These things always so hit and miss, right? I had a speaker a few months back. Did lots of advertising, and I think we had 2 students show up. So, you know, what can you do? It's just the way it works. I first want to thank Louis and Professor David Chittister, who made this happen. This, of course, happening was supposed to be in March of 20. I was in Cape Town, and within days of giving this, joining the seminar, I'd even gone into the building to find the room to make sure I knew where it was. And then, of course, Tasneem emailed to say, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. For good reason, right? We know what happened with the pandemic, which amazingly still continues to rule our lives. So here we are on Zoom more than a year later, but I really appreciate it. So the original idea was, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here. The book had just come out in February. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the book had, as Louis said, it had just come out in February, and the idea was to introduce you to this brand new publication, and that didn't happen. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do today. Just a few points. There's one specific case study that I'll make, and we'll take it from there. So I think I know where most of you are, mostly in Cape Town, right in the deep south there. This is where I am at. We just went through a beautiful fall. This is the center of campus here. And all the leaves are now gone, and it's starting to get really cold. But yeah, this is where Poughkeepsie is. If you go due north up from New York, about 70 miles or so, right up the Hudson River, you come to this town of Poughkeepsie, and that's where Vassar is located. And maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but we're a college, which means we have a terminal bachelor's degree. So you get a Bachelor of Arts. It's a 4-year degree, and you get a bachelor's degree. We don't have any graduate or postgraduate. If we did, we'd be called a university. That's the distinction, and it's sort of unique to the United States, I think. Right, so let's see a little bit of background, some beginnings. I write about this in the preface to the book, where Naim Inayatullah, who writes a forward to Elizabeth Daphne's novel, The Politics of Exile, right? He says that each of us writes about one substantive theme for the duration of our lives, and that the theme emerges from a trauma or a space-time wound. And so for me, nation state of South Africa, where I spent my childhood during the apartheid era, is a wound of sorts. And China, where I've invested, the last 30 years or so of my professional life, has become one too. And I write in the preface that I think our wounds can be salvational. In other words, I think our scholarship is always biographical on some level, regardless of what we're writing about, what the content is. And I embrace that. I never used to, but I do now. And then 5 themes that I'm thinking about that I try to bring together as part of the book. First, I just mentioned, right, 1989, apartheid. And then a couple of years later, I was standing in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, just reflecting on similarities and differences between what I thought of back then as 2 authoritarian regimes. A second theme would be David Chittister's work. In particular, I'm thinking of Savage Systems from 1996, which had a huge influence on me, thinking about colonialism and religion. I have there in parentheses plastic. That's that essay on Tupperware that he wrote in his book Authentic Fakes. The idea that communities, societies, groups do activities that bring them together in a Durkheimian sort of way, right? And we wouldn't ordinarily say, oh, that's religion or religious. But Chittister makes the case that they're doing religious work, which I embrace and appreciate. And then a third theme would be Charles Long. Two quotes from him that I've obsessed over for as long as I can remember, both from Significations, his book from, I think, 1986. Perhaps you're familiar with this. He says, there's a complex relationship between the meaning and nature of religion as a subject of academic study and the reality of the peoples and cultures who were conquered and colonized during the same period. So we're thinking about the 19th century here, which always shapes everything I think about, even if I'm writing about 2021. And then the second quote, for a greater part of history, cultural contact has come about as a result of the centripetal power of the city traditions. And here I'm thinking about, again, 19th century Beijing, capital of the Qing Empire, and then London with its, vast navy and colonial power that it was. So Long goes on to say that the tendency to expand the power of the center over the wider spatial areas, thereby bringing these spaces under the reign of the center and its ideology, assuring them a place in the legitimate and authentic structure of that reality designated and symbolized at the center. And this was a clash that occurred between Beijing and London. Both considered themselves to be, a center, the center with a capital C. And this is still reflected in China today. The very name of China, which you could see the, do a little laser pointer here for fun. These 2 ideographs, these characters here, Zhongguo, which is the name of China in Chinese, right? This one here with its sort of axis mundi coming through this rectangle, meaning central, axis. And then the square here designating the territory space of the territorial reaches, outer limits of the empire. And then the pictograph in the middle here is symbolic of the emperor. The emperor sits at the center of the empire. His capital city cosmologically sits at the center of the empire, and his throne is at the very center of that city, and he faces south. So long, another theme. And then two more themes here. One, rather, number 4 here, thinking about territorialization, right, which is so critical to nation state formation as a form of sacralization, and vice versa. So that's another theme. And then the 5th one being a long-standing desire on my part to develop a critique of maximalist, what I would call maximalist nationalism, specifically in China, but globally. No question, President Trump had a huge impact in the way that many of us think about radical nationalism, yeah. Anyhow, so I take Pankaj Mishra, the writer, to heart, where he says that a curious and skeptical sensibility would recognize that to stake one's position on national or civilizational superiority, something that China does indeed do, or turn the accident of birth into a source of pride is intellectually sterile, and I would add extremely dangerous. And I think, if anything, just the last 4 or 5 years has shown us that. Continue to see this. So these themes all kind of circulate throughout the text, and in my thinking about it. Then some of the issues at stake. Why China? Well, because that's just, the area that I focused on for my whole career. So, but also China because it functions nominally as a nation state, but I would suggest that it's more of a civilizational or a tributary empire. And it seeks to offer the world today in both subtle and not so subtle ways, what they call the third option, the old 20th century models of the United States and the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union. Today we could obviously think of the European Union as well as an example. But China says, no, we have another way to do this. We've been doing this for more than 2,000 years, and we're very successful at it. It's this notion of a benign authoritarianism. And then using South Africa to think about China as a way of thinking about the nation state. So I'll just read a short passage here from my preface. I say here that, here's the book, by the way. It's always backwards, isn't it? If China is my exemplum and the place in which I spend most time in this book, then South Africa is my muse. Both countries provide historical and textual moments to better understand the scaffolding of the nation state more broadly. South Africa is the metaphorical telescope and microscope that allows me to zoom in and out to generate a more philosophically complex picture of China, the nation state, and its categories, especially religion and the sacred. Also allows me the double vision about which Roland Barthes writes, that experience of looking out a car window and simultaneously seeing the glass right in front of you, but also seeing the landscape behind you further away. So looking up close, I write, we will examine constitutional and other state documents. And then gazing from afar, we will grapple with existential questions surrounding the nation state. And I argue that this dual vision enables us to raise questions about religion as a discursive, disciplining technique at work in nation-state building. And that definition really I get from Russell McCutcheon, who essentially explains religion as a discursive technique used in specific rhetorical situations, a type of social classification with significant political import. And that's certainly the way I would argue the category of religion is used in China today. We can talk more about that in a moment. So, okay. So there's some of the background, some of the issues at stake, but just to give one specific historical and contemporary example of what I think China is up to in using religiosity and using what I'll call theopolitics in a moment to define itself. You know, and obviously the what's the expression, the elephant in the room is that, you know, the Chinese Communist Party explicitly says that they are not religious, that to be a party member, you're not allowed to be affiliated with any religious group, although many of them are. Yeah. And Mao, of course, Chairman Mao, famous for trying to eradicate religiosity in China, but which had the exact opposite effect. So one example that I think you probably might be familiar with, the South China Sea. China claims all of this area, which is quite extraordinary. And in its constitution, it refers to all of its territory as sacred territory, and I'll get to that in a second. Let me just read another short passage here for you. So I say here that there's a long history in China of territory being deified. The northeastern part of China during the Qing Empire, for example, was understood to be the land of dragons and the ancestral home of the Manchus. All dynastic emperors were understood to be the son of heaven, the Tianzi acting in accordance with the heavens, and as such they could inflict a sacred violence for the purposes of stabilizing and expanding all under the heavens. And so, for instance, when the empire reached out to establish its hold in Central Asia during the 1750s under the leadership of the Qianlong emperor, he undertook genocide to wipe out the Dzungar, who no longer exist. And today, much of this area is now part of Xinjiang province. Xinjiang, up in the northwest part of China, literally means new territory. And this is where the majority of population are Uyghur, right? So we know what we know about the camps. We know what's going on up there. And Tibet and Taiwan are also other examples of this process of imagining new maps and new territorial claims. So to get back to the sacred territory here, if this is an official English translation from the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's website, and I'm looking specifically at this sentence here. So, the characters at the top, these four, this Shen Sheng Ling Tu, the first one refers to deities, refers to, it's made up of two components: to report to a superior, to manifest. But it's typically translated as God or deities. And then Sheng is sage, like Confucius, right, would be considered a Sheng. And then Ling Tu, we just translate as territory. It's got a long history to it. And so this sentence here, talking about Taiwan, which is very much in President Xi Jinping's vision right now, here referring to Taiwan as being part of the sacred territory of the People's Republic of China. And in other places and in other documents, this four-character term comes up all the time. These are very old characters, pictographs that have, I would argue, even an unconscious sort of pull on most Han Chinese, even if they're not familiar with the history. So sacred territories, and then back to the South China Sea, this would not be understood if China is claiming it to be part of its sacred territory, right? And so I make the argument in the book that to claim constitutionally that one's territory is sacred means that territorialization has become a form of sacralization. And I also unpack this in further detail in the book, you know, saying that it has deep implications for juridical constructions, containment of populace, for example, the Uyghurs in the Northwest, Tibet, and human rights in general. Yeah, so here we have, and I'm going to call this a theopolitical discourse of sorts, and theopolitical not in the way that, you know, folks like Martin Buber or Carl Schmitt, I mean, although I'm drawing obviously on Carl Schmitt to some extent, but theopolitical loosely in the sense of using cosmological schema, ancient cosmological schema, to underpin your claims, your political claims and your political motivations, right? Now the party would deny this, of course, and anything I say here today about religion in China, religiosity in China being a religious state, this would all be nonsense to them. But I would beg to differ. So yeah, they claim, so they have this nine, what they call the 9-dash line, 9 of these dashes, which everything within that they claim is part of their sacred territory. 9, by the way, also has profound cosmological meaning in Chinese history as well. And so maybe you know this, maybe not, what's been happening over the last sort of 6-7 years. They've been taking these atolls, right? So this is international water, right? Taking these submerged atolls, and they start, and this is in this particular case, this is Mischief Reef. This took less than 12 months. It's quite extraordinary. But they start pumping millions of tons of sand. You can see it right here on the edge. And what starts to happen is this. Environmentally, a complete disaster. Of course, they destroy all of the coral reefs below. And they turn these atolls into islands with, in this case, a huge radar installation, a deep water port, and a runway capable of handling China's largest warplanes. And they've done this, as far as I'm aware, at least 7 or 8 times now. And so now you've got physical territory, right? And then you claim all of the waters around that as well. And so strategically creating these islands throughout the South China Sea and then claiming this is all ours, this is all part of ours. About 3/4, I think, 3/4 of world trade goes through the South China Sea. So it has a lot of implications. The Philippines brought a case against China a couple of years back, took it all the way up to the International Court in The Hague, and the court ruled in their favor, saying that China cannot make these claims. And Beijing has simply just ignored it. This what can one do, right? Yeah, what can one do? I mean, you know, Admiral Davidson of the 7th Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, United States Navy, saying that it belongs to China unless you want to have an all-out war. You know, not much we can do. And then very importantly and tellingly, I think President Xi, in conversation with then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, talking about these islands, saying that we cannot lose even 1 inch of the territory left behind by our ancestors. So that's very powerful language that resonates in the Chinese subconscious. And the term that they usually use to translate these 2 characters here, this Zuguo, usually they're translated as motherland, but in fact this Zu is ancestral. So a far more accurate translation would be ancestral land, and the ancestors are for the most part male. So fatherland might be a better way to go, but it's really ancestral land. And so this is what President Xi is talking about, right? He's tapping into the idea that you cannot touch this territory because it was left behind by our ancestors, even though we just built these islands, a couple of years ago. So very powerful language. So here I argue that territory is sacralized, in this case, by virtue of the presence of the ancestors, state sanctification, and it becomes the inviolate. And when territorialization becomes a form of sacralization, right, I argue then the sacred becomes a spatial designation, and it's that territory, the state, that's designated as sacred and thus inviolate. And so part of the core argument of the book is that it's the inviolate that is the very core of the nation state. All nation states, I argue. And I've already taken, some book reviews have already criticized me for that I use China as my exemplum and implicate every nation state on the planet, which I'm happy to argue for. And then finally, I'll end with this here. Other examples of what I would call theopolitics. 2007, order number 5 is put out there, sent to every municipality throughout the country. And order number 5 states that any living Buddha in the Tibetan tradition, or Tulku is the name, any living Buddha who wishes to reincarnate first must request state permission. It's quite an extraordinary step. It's Foucault's biopolitics. It's the juridical system, controlling bodies, both past, present, and future. And another example of that would be the Dalai Lama's reincarnation, where, and obviously all having to do with control over Tibetan territory, but the Dalai Lama now claiming that he might not reincarnate. It's only, incidentally, it's only in Tibetan Buddhism that reincarnation takes place. And Tibetan Buddhism is less than 2% of the Buddhist world. So nonetheless, huge role in international politics, right? And then also in the Chinese Constitution, Article 36, 5 sentences, and sentence number 3 translates as the state protects normal religious activities, normal religion. So in other words, the Communist Party, avowedly atheist as they say, gets to decide what constitutes religiosity, what counts as religion, what's real religion as opposed to what they call superstition, which is banned. So just being that, religion as this discursive category is very much part of nation state building. And China is not exempt from that, and in fact uses it very aggressively. And I end up calling it a religious state, which, from a certain perspective makes no sense, but the way that I'm using the category and arguing for territorialization as a form of sacralization, I think I can call it a religious state, which is what I end up doing. So Great. I'm gonna stop there, and we can chat about anything. Hopefully that was semi-coherent. It is, 7:30 a.m. here.
Completely incoherent.
I'm barely awake, so it's great. I can just I don't have to be coherent. It's all good.
Hey, you're actually just gesturing to some of the concepts and the structures that you're using in your book, but there's there's very big claims to unpack here, some of which we're familiar with from reading Foucault, etc. But what I find interesting is when we do comparative religion or often do studies in a place like South Africa, we are often using secularism as some sort of comparative tool, which basically demonizes religion and positions it in a minority status in the private sphere. And then, as you said, you did say the state then controls the secular space, the public space, etc. So that's a well dug furrow into kind of the relationship between the state and religion. But what you seem to be reminding us of is the power of religion in terms of the sacralization of the state itself, and how the state actually claims the power of religion in certain aspects as its sacred power, not just the power to control its practice. So this for us is very interesting. Yes, Ala immediately is putting his hand up because we kind of teach some of these concepts in our courses. So perhaps in the discussions you can kind of bring out how that develops. And I'm also thinking of, most of our students will have come across Robert Beller's Civil Religion in America, where he also kind of shows that the secular state does have a religion, but it's orchestrated through this kind of quasi-civil justification where you can pray to God at a town meeting, and it had to go to the Supreme Court, etc., etc. So there's quite interesting comparisons between civil religion and what you're calling a theopolitical state religion. So they're my initial observations, but shall we take a couple of questions? Ala and then Tammy.
Presentation, I wish we were in our department and seeing you face to face. My comment are building on what Louis had raised. When we think about religious as a state, as a religious state, we then confronted with the process of secularization. I don't want to say the dichotomy of secularization. So what are the process of secularization in Egypt at the bureaucratic level, at the constitutional level? That's one. But my second point, you describe religion as a discursive technique. And when we speak about discursive technique, you invite us to think about Michel Foucault, which had inspired religious study. But that means when we think of discursive, we think of a debate and knowledge production, discursive formation. How religion, I'm apologizing about the noise around me. I'm very sorry if it's noisy. How religion is debated in China, and how did religion constitute a field of knowledge in China, beside its the way in which it's been evoked symbolically or used to claim territory. In fact, all nationhood had its own sacred territory. And we mean many times discussed in our department how religion and nationalism are very much the same regime of power and regime of aesthetic. So to sum up my question, what are the debate and knowledge production in relation to China, and how this constitute part in the everyday and the practice and the nation policies and all this? Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. I agree with everything both you and Louis just said. In terms of the internal debates in China, I mean, obviously there's a long history, right? And not that long, actually, in terms of Chinese history. It goes back to the 19th century, where, of course, like every other part of the planet, there is no term in Chinese for religion. And when confronted by, excuse me, mostly by the British, with God, trade, guns, and opening up the ports, we have the Opium Wars, we have missionaries coming into the Qing Empire. All of a sudden, they need to come up with a term for this thing, religion. With Christianity, right? I mean, most of the time, religion simply just means Christianity historically, with the export of Christianity in the 19th century. And so they don't have a term. So now that's not to say there's no, that's not to say there's no religion in China. That's ridiculous. There's Buddhists, there's Taoists, there's Confucian, there's all kinds of things happening. And we can identify these groups, and they self-identify as Buddhist or Taoist or whatever, and we can say that's a religious group, and that's fine. I think I don't have any problem with that. But as a category, the term didn't exist. So they borrow from Japan, who had a similar scenario when they confronted by Commander Perry in the 19th century, who shows up outside of Edo, now called Tokyo, and says, open up your ports for trade or I start shooting. And that's what he did. He started firing. And the Japanese had the same problem. They had to come up with a term in trade to deal with this category of Christianity. And they borrowed from China 2 categories, Shukyo, and then later on, China then borrows it back, so it's a neologism. And the same characters are pronounced Zongjiao. And so Zongjiao is the term that's used for religion in China today. And the debates, so they unwittingly, I would argue, import a very Protestant understanding of the category of religion. And so the debates look like that. When they talk about religion, they reify it. They will say, I'm talking about the 19th century, but even well into the 20th century, especially with Chairman Mao, what do we get rid of when we eradicate religion from society and scientize everything and become a secular society, modern society? Well, using this reified understanding, this European understanding of what constitutes religion is, this group with a God, a text, etc. And so those were the types of debates that were occurring in the mid 20th century, which is, who do we identify as religion as opposed to non-religion, and how do we get rid of them? And that didn't go very far, because clearly they couldn't. People just, go underground, so to speak, and these groups flourish today still. So then the question became, okay, we cannot get rid of religion. So how do we control it, right? How do we ensure, and this is still very much the debates that take place today in 2021, how do we ensure that the loyalty of Chinese Christians or Chinese Buddhists, or biggest problem, biggest challenge for the Communist Party, Chinese Muslims, how do we ensure that their loyalty is with the state, with the Communist Party, and not with their gods, their deities? And that's always the challenge. And it's interesting, the government to this day formally only recognizes what they call the 5 religions, which is Buddhism, Taoism, not Confucianism. Confucianism, oh, that's philosophy, that's education. They move that out of the religious realm. They de-religiousize it, if that's not a word, I know. Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, And then they split Christianity into two, into Protestantism and Catholicism. And the reason they do that is because Catholicism for the Communist Party is a very special group, because we got a problem here. We've got a Pope who's God's representative on earth, and Catholics in China are loyal to the Pope and not to the party. So they split up those two, which is kind of interesting. And that's it. That's it. Everything else is illegal. And for the most part, if you are gathering in small groups and doing your practices and rituals, most of the time, government is not going to do anything. But should you become larger, more powerful, start advertising, start drawing in practitioners, then you get shut down and usually arrested. And people disappear all the time in China every day. Anyway, long-winded way. I'm not sure if I got to all of your questions, but yeah, that's the gist of the debates that have been happening for a long time now.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but limited time.
Yep.
And Tammy, you had a question?
I do. You hear me?
Yes.
Good. Hi, Prof. Walsh. I don't think it's fully formed. I'm also coming to you from upstate New York, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm in Hamilton.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so it's bloody dark right now. But let me say, I like that you just pointed to the fact that there are 5 recognized religions, because the entire time you were speaking, I had the picture of the last sort of era of the British Empire into Africa, trying to sort of save the imperial project through religiosity. And then the way in which they can control religion, at least from my experience in Kenya, is to classify, yes, as you just showed, and then give perhaps patronage, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of very nice for historians, at least, to sort of observe the colonial project taking place in the 21st century. Not that we ever sort of disavowed ourselves with the idea that colonialism is gone. But what I would like to know, I just read this morning that the UN delegation has set foot in Taiwan for the first time.
Oh.
Yeah. And so how does this wave of religious formation, sterilization as sacralization, play out in the 21st century? What are its stakes in this political moment? How does these competing notions taking place in Beijing about autonomy and personhood, as we now know that Hong Kong has been drawn back into the mainland, how do these orientations buttress or go up against this very totalizing project of what religion intends to be for the state? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us you so early in the morning as well, up in Hamilton. You know, it's a little bit, so there's always, you're quite right. I never talk about post-colonialism because I feel like when did colonialism ever end? So, you know, we still sort of in the colonial mode, I would argue, and China is as well, for sure. I'll keep it as simple as I can. I mean, I'm thinking of Jonathan Z. Smith, right? So Smith arguing, okay, religion is a category of emplacement from the scholar's study. And of course, Charles Long famously said, which scholar, which study, you know, or as Mallory Nye talks about the white elephant in the room, you know, the white scholar. So China is playing a very similar game to what occurs in Europe with the so-called sacralization thesis, right? Which is that there are these things out there, these nouns called religions, and we need to control them. That's one side of it. The other side is somebody like me saying, okay, China's claims to Taiwan are theocratic in some ways. They are theopolitical. Taiwan then gets, just much like the South China Sea, gets designated as part of the sacred territory. And indeed, in the Constitution, it says it's the sacred duty, and it uses the same characters for sacred, of every Chinese citizen to fight to the death, basically, and to take back Taiwan. And so, yeah, I didn't realize if there's a UN delegation there this morning, Beijing is going to go crazy. They, one step away from physically, from attacking Taiwan. It's quite terrifying. And so, again, they can use these cosmological schema with these religious, projects, I would argue. Again, this discursive technique of expanding territory and justifying it in terms of the ancestors, and arguing, of course, Taiwan comes back to us in the same way that we've got Hong Kong back, in the same way that Tibet has always been part of our territory, which is just not true. It's just not the case. And same thing with Taiwan. I mean, China couldn't have cared less about Taiwan up until the 19th century. Maybe you can make a case in the 17th and 18th, but so I see that playing out there too. I see the claims to Taiwan, territorial claims, being part of this whole notion of sacred territory. For me, that's a religious project. That's so we know the secular thesis is come and gone. It doesn't function anymore, I don't think, and I think very much along the lines of, when I'm thinking of secular religion, not as a dichotomy, but the way that Timothy Fitzgerald explains it, right, that historically in Europe you had secular monks who lived outside of the monastery, then you had religious monks who lived inside of the monastery. They're all still monks, so that category of the secular, I think, is quite empty at this point in time. Tammy, I don't know if that completely responds to your question.
No, that's great. I think it's always interesting to figure out how these figurations play out in the post-colonial world, and what is at stake when we sort of designated a post-colonial world and then continue to look for its guise.
Yes.
Or the specter of it. Yeah, I find this project particularly fascinating because it gives African scholars a distance by looking at the quote orient, but then there's also like a weird embodied reality that's something we know is taking place. We can familiarize with it. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe that's an ontological thing in and of itself, but yeah. There's resonance there. Thank you, Prof.
Absolutely, thank you. Oh, Louis, I think you muted. Yeah.
I made the basic error, didn't I? We have a question from Galen. If you could keep it fairly brief.
Hi. Yes. Okay. Hi. Very quickly. Thanks, Prof. That was really great, and I look forward to reading the book as well. Actually, I'm just wondering. The question. It's kind of. I'm just one chicken and egg question about is China taking a religious stance because it's religion, or is it taking it as a kind of a power stance? Religion, that the sacred offers a kind of a power position. So by saying that China's claiming the sacred, is it necessarily acting religiously, or is it just kind of acting politically by claiming religious power?
Ah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, my default quick response would be it's acting politically. So that religiosity is, and I was criticized for this in a couple of book reviews where I do, you know, I am saying, do not reify the term. It's problematic. I reify the nation state. I reify the category of the sacred. I admit to that. It just is. It's there. The sacrality of social relations is what I would call politics.
Okay.
But there's another side to just, you know, that's somewhat unique to China, but also not. I mean, we see this play out in all nation states where the violence, it goes back to Max Weber, right? That the right to kill, the sovereign, right? George Agamben as well. The sovereign has the right to put into place the state of exception. The sovereign has the right to kill. The nation state has the right to kill without any repercussion. And so that right to kill is imbued with a sacrality, I would argue, so that the kind of violence that nation states impose systematically to protect their borders or to expand their borders or to lay claims to territory like the South China Sea or Russia and Crimea, etc. And we could think of the United States too. Manifest destiny, it's God's will that we, you know, I used the example of the Battle of Blood River, right, in the preface as well. It's God's will that we take and conquer this territory and kill these people. And so for me, it's always about power. And so then the messiness of the term religion or religiosity or the sacred, you know, I'm as guilty as anyone of sort of conflating these things and muddling them up. But in theory, they ought to be, we ought to be far more discreet with them and careful how we use them. Yeah.
If it's even possible to be discreet with them, we are looking at complex systems. So, okay, thank you for your answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really like your reminder that the state or the religion backs into the state rather than this idea that the state is always interested in separating itself from religion. But that sacrality which backs into state power, and, you know, in the European case, which is obviously different, you know, can go all the way back to 1648 and the Peace of Augsburg? No, Westphalia, Peace of Westphalia, where the nation state becomes somewhat both secularized and sacralized. And what I kind of also noted just as a comment is in this case, although it's not particularly the exact replica of Western forms of secularity, you do get these inviolate, what you called inviolate forms. So human rights is considered, you know, even though it's a formal discourse rather than anything, it's a metaphysical claim. These are considered inviolate rights that the individual has. And you're reminding us in the case of China that the state itself sees itself as inviolate in both its authority, as you said, the sovereign nature of power there, but also in its territory. So you get this kind of like cluster of inviolate terms that are used to actually give justification to that power system. And then the odd thing that also said, then you actually have something which is not inviolate, the ancestors. It's entirely contingent that you happen to bury your ancestors in the land even for a very long time, but it's not a metaphysical inviolation. And yet it then becomes this contingent symbolic supplement or ground to that, you know, those claims. These are just comments. What I think we find is we could benefit from a longer conversation, and perhaps we can invite Michael to a discussion or perhaps a workshop on these issues at some point in time. Because we've only scratched the surface of some of these issues.
I would love that. I would love that. I was so disappointed when, you know, when I couldn't, when I was actually on campus, University of Cape Town, and so close to meeting all of you and doing the seminar in person, and then of course COVID, you know.
Okay, fantastic. So I think we're going to have to, and it's also unfortunate one of our students, Hayden Weaver, isn't here because he's just done a master's on divine violence using Walter Benjamin.
Oh, perfect, yeah.
And he would basically argue that China's description isn't divine violence at all. It's means ends political mythology, whereas Benjamin will have a different account.
Mm.
However, so unfortunately we have to end at this point, but I think we will be in conversation with Michael, and maybe we can invite him back in some form, or have some sort of longer engagement with some of these issues.
Sounds good to me. Well, thank you so much, Louis, and thanks to all of you for joining. I really appreciate it. You know, it's been great.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you.